During the second half of the 20th century, the world was locked in a titanic struggle, a silent yet ever-present war of ideas, ideologies, and influence. This was the Cold War, a global chess match between two superpowers, the United States, championing capitalism and democracy, and the Soviet Union, the standard-bearer of communism. This wasn't a war fought with massive armies clashing on open fields, but rather a contest waged in the shadows, in proxy conflicts, and in the hearts and minds of people across the globe. It was a zero-sum game. A gain for one side was seen as a devastating loss for the other. In this high-stakes environment, intelligence agencies became the front-line soldiers, and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, found itself at the very heart of this conflict. Its mission was not just to gather information, but to actively shape events, to push back against the perceived tide of communism wherever it might rise. And one region in particular became a primary battleground in this clandestine war: Latin America. To understand why the CIA became so deeply enmeshed in the political affairs of its southern neighbors, we have to look back even further than the Cold War, to the year 1823. This was when President James Monroe articulated what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. In essence, it was a bold declaration to the powers of Europe. The Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization. It established the idea of Latin America as the United States' sphere of influence. For over a century, this doctrine guided American foreign policy in the region, often leading to military and economic interventions to protect U.S. interests. Now, fast forward to the post-World War II era. This long-standing view of Latin America as its backyard merged with a new urgent global strategy, the doctrine of containment. Coined by diplomat George F. Kennan, containment became the cornerstone of American Cold War policy. The goal was simple, yet monumental: to stop the spread of Soviet communism at all costs. The fusion of the old Monroe Doctrine with the new policy of containment created a potent and volatile mix. Any political shift in Latin America, no matter how small or localized, was now viewed through the high-stakes lens of the global ideological battle. The region was no longer just a sphere of influence. It was a critical defensive line against a global adversary. This fear of communist expansion was crystallized in a simple but powerful concept: the domino theory. This was the belief, widely held in Washington's corridors of power, that if one single nation fell to communism, it would set off an unstoppable chain reaction, toppling its neighbors one by one like a row of dominoes. Imagine a map in a smoky back room at the Pentagon, with red ink spreading from one country to the next. That was the nightmare scenario that policymakers were desperate to avoid. This theory wasn't just an abstract idea. It became a core justification for proactive and often aggressive intervention. The potential fall of even a small, seemingly insignificant nation in Central or South America was viewed as a potential existential threat to American security and global standing. The stakes were perceived as being that high. A socialist government in Guatemala, a populist leader in Brazil, or a land reform movement in Chile, these weren't seen as domestic political developments. They were seen as the first domino beginning to wobble, threatening to bring the entire structure crashing down. This theory provided the moral and strategic imperative for the CIA to do whatever was necessary to ensure those dominoes remained standing upright, firmly aligned with Western interests. This brings us to the crucial element of how the Cold War was actually fought on the ground in Latin America. The threat wasn't typically a Soviet army marching across the border. Instead, the primary fear was internal subversion. From the perspective of U.S. intelligence, the enemy was often already inside the gates. What did this enemy look like? It wasn't always a clandestine agent with a fake passport. More often, it was a charismatic populist leader rallying the poor, a determined labor union organizer demanding better wages and working conditions, or even a democratically elected socialist president who promised to nationalize key industries, like mining or agriculture, which were often owned by American corporations. These movements and leaders were frequently homegrown, responding to genuine local grievances of inequality, poverty, and a history of foreign exploitation. They spoke of national sovereignty, social justice, and economic independence. However, in the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, these nuances were often lost. U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, had a tendency to see the hand of Moscow or Havana behind every popular uprising. Any ideology that leaned left, that spoke of redistributing wealth or challenging the power of multinational corporations, was immediately suspect. These movements were often labeled, whether accurately or not, as Soviet or Cuban proxies. Their leaders were seen not as independent nationalists, but as pawns in a larger geopolitical game, manipulated by foreign communist powers. This perspective transformed domestic political struggles into international crises. It meant that a farm workers' strike or a student protest could be interpreted as the opening salvo of a communist takeover, demanding a swift and decisive response. This framing of internal dissent as external aggression gave the CIA a broad mandate to intervene, to disrupt, and to neutralize these perceived threats by any means necessary. The Cold War context set the stage for the CIA's actions across Latin America. Now, we're diving deeper into the how, the specific methods and covert operations that reshaped the political landscape of an entire continent. This is where the theory meets the ground, often with devastating consequences. At the heart of the CIA's strategy was the training and funding of local forces. One of the most infamous institutions in this effort was the U.S. Army School of the Americas, or SOA, located for many years in Panama. Often dubbed the School of Assassins by its critics, the SOA trained tens of thousands of Latin American military personnel. The curriculum officially focused on counterinsurgency, intelligence gathering, and military tactics. However, declassified manuals and testimonies from graduates reveal a much darker side. These manuals, sometimes referred to as the CIA playbook, taught methods of psychological warfare, coercion, and control. They detailed techniques for interrogation, surveillance, and managing informants. More chillingly, they provided a framework for suppressing internal dissent, often blurring the line between a legitimate threat and any form of political opposition. The training emphasized a brutal efficiency, prioritizing the elimination of perceived leftist threats over the protection of human rights. Graduates of the SOA went on to hold high-ranking positions in their home countries' militaries and intelligence agencies. Many were later implicated in some of the worst human rights abuses of the 20th century, including massacres, torture, and forced disappearances. The training provided at places like the SOA created a network of ideologically aligned military leaders across the continent, loyal to the anti-communist cause and equipped with the skills to enforce it, often with extreme prejudice. This wasn't just about teaching soldiers how to fight. It was about shaping the minds of future leaders to see their own people, students, union leaders, clergy, and activists, as the internal enemy. But training local forces was just one piece of the puzzle. The CIA also became masters of propaganda and psychological warfare, or PSYOPs. The goal was to destabilize democratically elected governments that were perceived as being too friendly with the left. This was a war for hearts and minds, fought not with bullets but with information and disinformation. The agency would secretly fund newspapers, radio stations, and political parties that were friendly to U.S. interests. They would plant stories, often fabricated or wildly exaggerated, to create an atmosphere of chaos, fear, and economic instability. For instance, they would spread rumors that a left-leaning government was planning to seize private property, abolish religion, or even take children away from their parents. In a deeply Catholic and socially conservative region, these narratives were incredibly potent. The CIA would finance student groups and labor unions to stage protests and strikes, paralyzing cities and making the incumbent government appear incompetent and unable to maintain order. The objective was to erode public trust and create a political crisis so severe that a military takeover would seem like the only viable solution to restore stability. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to turn a country against its own elected leaders, manufacturing a pretext for intervention. When propaganda and political manipulation weren't enough, the CIA moved to more direct methods, funding and arming opposition groups. This could range from providing cash to nonviolent political opponents to supplying weapons and logistical support to right-wing paramilitary groups or factions within a country's military that were plotting a coup. The agency acted as a hidden hand, identifying disgruntled elements within a society and empowering them to challenge the existing government. They provided the resources, the intelligence, and often the strategic guidance needed for these groups to succeed. This created a shadow army, operating outside the law but with the backing of a global superpower, ready to act when the moment was right. This brings us to the most direct form of intervention, support for coup d'état. Two of the most well-documented and consequential examples are the 1954 coup in Guatemala and the 1973 coup in Chile. In 1954, Guatemala was led by the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. His government had initiated a land reform program that aimed to redistribute uncultivated land from large estates to landless peasants. This directly threatened the interests of the powerful American-owned United Fruit Company, which owned vast tracts of land in the country. Portraying Arbenz as a communist puppet, the CIA launched Operation PB Success. They trained and armed a small rebel force led by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. But the real weapon was psychological. A CIA-run clandestine radio station broadcasted propaganda, exaggerating the size and success of the rebel force and spreading panic. CIA pilots flew unmarked planes, dropping leaflets and creating the illusion of a full-scale invasion. The Guatemalan army, demoralized and unwilling to fight what they believed was a US-backed invasion, refused to support Arbenz. He was forced to resign, and Castillo Armas was installed as dictator, rolling back the land reforms and ushering in decades of brutal military rule and civil war. Nearly 20 years later, a similar playbook was used in Chile. In 1970, Salvador Allende, a Marxist, was democratically elected president. His platform of nationalizing key industries, including the US-owned copper mines, set off alarm bells in Washington. President Nixon famously ordered the CIA to make the economy scream. The agency funneled millions of dollars to opposition groups, funded massive propaganda campaigns, and instigated strikes to cripple the country. They actively sought to provoke a military coup. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, launched their attack. They bombed the presidential palace and Allende died during the assault. Pinochet seized power, establishing a brutal dictatorship that would last for 17 years. During his rule, tens of thousands were tortured, killed, or disappeared. The CIA did not pull the trigger, but they had created the conditions, encouraged the plotters, and provided the support that made the coup possible. The ultimate outcome of these interventions was almost always the installation of authoritarian regimes. The primary goal was to prevent the spread of communism, and from that perspective, the CIA's operations were often successful. The leaders they installed were reliably anti-communist. However, this single-minded focus came at a terrible price. In the name of fighting one form of totalitarianism, the US often enabled another. They backed right-wing military juntas and dictators who were just as repressive, if not more so, than the communist regimes they opposed. The very democratic principles that the United States claimed to champion were sacrificed for the sake of geopolitical strategy. The legacy of these actions was not democracy and freedom, but decades of violence, instability, and deep-seated anti-American sentiment throughout Latin America. The CIA's covert war left deep scars on the continent, and the ghosts of Guatemala, Chile, and many other nations still haunt the region today. A stark reminder of how the pursuit of a single objective can lead to devastating and unintended consequences. The dominoes didn't just fall, they shattered, and the pieces cut deep into the fabric of Latin American societies. The Cold War interventions, meant to be surgical strikes against communism, became a source of chronic generational trauma. The human cost was staggering and immediate. In the southern cone, a shadow fell across the land, a coordinated campaign of terror known as Operation Condor. With the backing and intelligence support of the United States, right-wing military dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia joined forces. Their shared mission? To hunt down and eliminate political opponents, real or imagined, across borders. This wasn't just warfare. It was a systematic project of state-sponsored terror. Torture became an institutional practice. Secret detention centers, places like Villa Grimaldi in Chile or the ESMA in Argentina, became infamous chambers of horror where unspeakable acts were committed to break the human spirit. Thousands were disappeared, abducted from their homes, their jobs, their lives, never to be seen again. They became the desaparecidos, their families left in a perpetual state of unknowing, a psychological torment that endures to this day. Extrajudicial killings were commonplace. Dissidents, student leaders, union organizers, artists, and even priests were executed, their bodies often disposed of in unmarked graves or dropped from airplanes into the ocean. The goal was to silence dissent, not just by eliminating opponents, but by instilling a paralyzing fear in the entire population. The numbers are chilling. Estimates suggest tens of thousands were killed, and hundreds of thousands were imprisoned and tortured across the region during this dark period. Each number represents a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future stolen. This was the immediate, brutal price of containment. Beyond the immediate bloodshed, the interventions inflicted a deep, lasting wound on the region's political development. The dream of stable, homegrown democracy was systematically dismantled. In country after country, popularly elected governments, even those that were moderately left-leaning but still operating within a democratic framework, were overthrown. Think of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, or Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. These weren't just changes in leadership, they were assassinations of the democratic process itself. The message sent from Washington was clear. Popular sovereignty was acceptable only as long as it produced results favorable to U.S. interests. Any deviation, any attempt at genuine economic or political self-determination, would be met with overwhelming force. This created a devastating cycle. The military, empowered and emboldened by U.S. support, came to see itself as the ultimate arbiter of national politics. Democratic institutions, parliaments, courts, free presses, were weakened, bypassed, or shut down entirely. The very concept of civilian rule became fragile. When democracy did eventually return to these nations, it was a democracy haunted by ghosts. The military often retained significant power and influence, looming as a constant threat should the political winds shift again. The populace, having witnessed the futility of the ballot box and the brutality of the state, grew cynical and distrustful of political institutions. This erosion of democratic norms created a legacy of instability that continues to plague many Latin American nations. The coups of the 20th century didn't pave the way for stable pro-American allies. They created a political vacuum, often filled by further conflict, corruption, and authoritarianism for decades to come. The foundation of democracy, once shattered, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. Ironically, the very policy designed to contain communism and win hearts and minds for the American way of life achieved the exact opposite. The heavy-handed interventions, the support for brutal dictators, and the blatant disregard for national sovereignty fueled a profound and enduring anti-American sentiment across the entire continent. For generations of Latin Americans, the United States was not seen as a beacon of freedom and democracy, but as a colonial power, a Norteamericano puppeteer, pulling the strings of their torturers and oppressors. This resentment wasn't just abstract political disagreement. It was personal. It was born from the stories of disappeared loved ones, the memory of military patrols in the streets, and the economic hardship imposed by U.S.-backed regimes. This deep-seated anger and distrust didn't just push moderate movements away, it radicalized them. When democratic, peaceful avenues for change were violently closed off, many concluded that the only option left was armed struggle. The actions of the CIA and the U.S. government became the most effective recruiting tool for Marxist and other radical anti-capitalist groups. Figures like Che Guevara became continental icons not just because of their ideology, but because they represented defiance against a common enemy. The United States, in its quest to eliminate the perceived threat of Soviet influence, ended up creating a new generation of revolutionaries whose primary motivation was opposition to American imperialism. The Monroe Doctrine, originally conceived to keep foreign powers out, was twisted into a justification for perpetual intervention, pushing the very people it claimed to be protecting into the arms of its ideological foes. The legacy is a continent where "Yankee Go Home" became a defining political slogan, a deep wound in hemispheric relations that has yet to fully heal. So, we arrive at the central tragedy, the CIA's great self-inflicted wound. The biggest blunder was not a single failed operation, but the entire strategic doctrine. The short-term calculus of the Cold War, winning at any cost, stopping communism's spread no matter the method, led to a catastrophic long-term strategic failure. The objective was to cultivate a hemisphere of stable, prosperous pro-US democracies that would serve as reliable partners and bulwarks against Soviet influence. But the means used to achieve this end guaranteed its failure. By propping up psychopathic dictators, training their death squads, and overthrowing democratically elected leaders, the United States sabotaged its own goals. It sacrificed the long-term project of building genuine alliances based on shared values for the short-term illusion of control. The stable regimes it installed were built on foundations of sand and terror, destined to collapse and leave behind a legacy of chaos, violence, and bitterness. The pro-US sentiment it hoped to foster was replaced by a deep-seated and justified resentment. The democracies it claimed to be protecting were the very things it helped destroy. In the grand chess game of the Cold War, the CIA and US policymakers saw Latin America as a collection of pawns to be sacrificed. They won battles, toppling governments and eliminating adversaries. But in doing so, they lost the war for the soul of the hemisphere. They failed to create the future they wanted, and instead helped create a present haunted by the ghosts of their own making. This wasn't just a foreign policy mistake. It was a profound moral and strategic failure, a blunder whose consequences echo from the Rio Grande to Patagonia. A stark reminder that the path to hell is often paved with geopolitical intentions.